The mahogany door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the marble hallway of Whitman and Associates law firm. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes of my family settling into leather chairs around a conference table I wasn't invited to occupy. The muffled voices carried just enough to make out my brother Marcus's laugh, that same hollow sound he'd perfected at every family gathering where I'd been the punchline. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My grandmother's funeral was 3 days ago. 3 days of condolences, casseroles, and conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. 3 days of my stepmother Patricia orchestrating every detail with military precision, treating me like hired help rather than family. And now, sitting on this cold marble bench outside the reading of Grandma Rose's will, I was exactly where they wanted me. Outside. Excluded. Forgotten. The leather of my purse strap dug into my shoulder as I shifted, trying to find a position that didn't make me feel like I was begging for scraps. 26 years old, and I still felt like the scared little girl who'd moved in with Grandma Rose after my mother died. The little girl who'd been tolerated, not treasured, when Dad remarried Patricia 2 years later. I pressed my ear closer to the door, not caring how desperate it made me look. The receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, had already glanced my way twice with something that looked like pity. She knew I should be in there. How everyone in this building probably knew the Caldwell family dynamics better than I did at this point. The primary residence on Elmwood Drive, came the lawyer's voice, professional and measured, goes to Marcus Caldwell, along with the attached property and all furnishings. My stomach clenched. Grandma Rose's house, the place where I'd spent my happiest years, where she'd taught me to bake her famous apple turnovers, where we'd sit on the porch swing every summer evening talking about everything and nothing. The house where she'd promised just 6 months ago that I'd always have a home. The investment portfolio, valued at approximately $2.7 million, is to be divided equally between Marcus Caldwell and Jessica Caldwell. Jessica, my stepsister who'd only visited Grandma Rose twice in the last 5 years, both times to ask for money. Jessica who'd rolled her eyes at the funeral when I'd read the eulogy, whispering something to Patricia that made them both smirk behind their tissues. The voices grew more animated now, congratulations being passed around like champagne as at a celebration I wasn't invited to attend. I heard Patricia's voice, sharp with satisfaction. Rose always did appreciate family loyalty. Family loyalty. The phrase hit me like a slap. I'd been there every week for the last 8 years, every doctor's appointment, every grocery run, every lonely Thursday when Grandma Rose would call just to hear another voice. I'd rearranged my work schedule at the veterinary clinic countless times to drive her to physical therapy after her hip surgery. I'd held her hand for 2 hospitalizations and celebrated with her when the cancer scans came back clear last spring. But Marcus, who called maybe twice a year, and Jessica, who treated Grandma Rose like an ATM, they were the family. I was just the help who happened to share DNA. The door handle turned, and I scrambled back to a respectable distance from the door, clutching my purse like a shield. Marcus emerged first, his expensive suit perfect as always, followed by Jessica in her designer dress that probably cost more than I made in 2 months. Patricia brought up the rear, her smile sharp as a blade when she spotted me still sitting there. "Anna, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You didn't have to wait. I told you the reading was just a formality for the primary beneficiaries." Primary beneficiaries, as if I were some distant cousin who'd shown up hoping for table scraps. Marcus didn't even look at me as he checked his phone, already moving on to more important things. "We'll need to get the house appraised," he said to Patricia as if I were invisible. "Market's good right now for that neighborhood." "You're selling Grandma Rose's house?" The words escaped before I could stop them. Jessica finally acknowledged my existence with a laugh that could cut glass. "What else would we do with it? None of us need that old place." old place, the house where Grandma Rose had lived for 43 years, where she'd raised my father after Grandpa died young, where every room held memories that apparently meant nothing to them. I started, but Patricia cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. Anna, honey, maintaining a property like that requires resources you simply don't have. It's better this way. Marcus will ensure it goes to a family who can properly care for it. Properly care for it. As if love wasn't enough. As if the 8 years I'd spent weeding her garden and fixing her leaky faucets and painting her guest room the exact shade of yellow she'd dreamed about meant nothing because I didn't have a trust fund to back it up. They moved past me toward the elevators, a family unit complete without me. I sat frozen on that bench, watching their backs retreat, when I heard it. "Excuse me, is Anna Caldwell still in the building?" The voice belonged to a man I'd never seen before. Tall, with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen 1,000 important meetings. He wasn't Mr. Whitman, the family lawyer I'd expected. This man had an authority that made even Patricia pause mid-step. "I'm Anna," I managed, my voice smaller than I intended. He extended his hand with a firm shake that felt like an anchor in stormy seas. "Daniel Morrison, Morrison and Associates. I represent your grandmother's estate in certain ways, additional matters." Additional matters. The words hung in the air like a question mark nobody wanted to answer. Patricia's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly. "I wasn't aware Rose had retained additional counsel." Mr. Morrison's smile was polite, but somehow managed to convey that Patricia's awareness wasn't his primary concern. Mrs. Caldwell was quite thorough in her estate planning. There are several provisions that require Ms. Anna's presence. Ms. Anna, not just Anna, not the afterthought they'd grown accustomed to dismissing. Ms. Anna, spoken with the same respect he'd give any client. Marcus finally looked up from his phone, irritation replacing indifference. "What kind of provisions?" "The kind that are best discussed in private with the relevant parties," Mr. Morrison replied smoothly. "Ms. Anna, would you be available to meet tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock? I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to clasp them in my lap to hide it. "Is this really necessary?" Patricia's tone had shifted from false sweetness to barely concealed annoyance. "We've already concluded the primary reading." "I'm afraid it is necessary, Mrs. Caldwell. Your late mother-in-law was quite specific about the timing and the parties involved." Mr. Morrison handed me a business card, his finger steady where mine trembled. "Until tomorrow, then, Ms. Anna." He walked away with the same quiet authority he'd arrived with, leaving the four of us standing in an awkward cluster by the elevators. The silence stretched until Jessica let out a nervous laugh. "Probably just some old jewelry or something," she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Grandma Rose always did have a flair for the dramatic. But I remembered the way Grandma Rose had looked at me during our last conversation. Propped up in her hospital bed with tubes snaking from her arms, she'd grabbed my hand with surprising strength and said, "Don't let them make you feel like you don't belong, Anna. Promise me." At the time, I thought she was talking about the funeral, about standing up straight and not letting their coldness diminish me during the service. Now, watching Patricia's carefully constructed composure crack around the edges, I wondered if she'd meant something else entirely. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and they stepped inside without looking back. As the door slid shut, I caught a glimpse of Marcus whispering something urgent to Patricia, her face pale beneath her expertly applied makeup. I remained standing in that marble hallway long after they'd gone, Mr. Morrison's business card growing warm in my palm. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one being left behind. For the first time in my adult life, someone wanted to include me in something that mattered. The receptionist with kind eyes was packing up her desk when I finally moved toward the exit. She looked up as I passed, and something in her expression made me pause. "Your grandmother?" she said softly. "She came here several times over the past 2 years.
always asked specifically for Mr. Morrison, always insisted their meetings be completely confidential. 2 years. Grandma Rose had been planning something for 2 years, long before her health had started declining, long before the family had started circling like vultures, calculating the value of her assets and deciding who deserved what. She talked about you, the receptionist continued, gathering her things with deliberate care, said you were the only one who visited for the right reasons. The words hit me like a warm wave, washing away some of the ice that had settled in my chest during the reading. Grandma Rose had seen it all, the way they treated me, the way they excluded me, the way they took my care for granted while treating me like an outsider in my own family. "Thank you," I whispered, not trusting my voice with anything more substantial. I walked out into the late afternoon sunshine, Atlanta's autumn air crisp against my skin. The city buzzed around me, cars honking, people rushing to catch buses, the ordinary chaos of life continuing, while my world had tilted on its axis. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Don't get your hopes up about tomorrow. Some things are just too good to be true."
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I stared at the message, feeling something shift inside me. For years, I'd accepted their version of my place in this family, the grateful recipient of their tolerance, the one who should be thankful for whatever scraps of affection they threw my way. But Grandma Rose had seen something different. She'd made plans, retained separate counsel, created additional provisions that required my presence. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't being excluded from something important. I deleted Patricia's message without responding and walked to my car with my head held higher than it had been in years. Tomorrow morning couldn't come fast enough. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Morrison's confident face and heard Patricia's warning text echoing in my mind. By 9:30 the next morning, I was already sitting in the parking garage beneath Morrison and Associates, gripping my steering wheel and trying to steady my breathing. The building was different from Whitman and Associates, sleeker, more modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that seemed to promise transparency rather than hide secrets behind frosted glass. I took the elevator to the 15th floor, my reflection multiplied endlessly in the polished steel doors. The receptionist who greeted me was younger than yesterday's silver-haired woman, with bright red lipstick and a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Anna Caldwell, Mr. Morrison is expecting you. Can I get you coffee? Water?" The kindness in her voice almost made me tear up. After years of being treated like an inconvenience by my own family, simple courtesy felt like luxury. "Coffee would be great, thank you." She led me down a hallway lined with oil paintings of Atlanta's skyline through the decades, past conference rooms with names like Peachtree and Buckhead. Mr. Morrison's office was at the end, corner windows offering a view of the city that made me feel like I was floating above all my problems. "Anna," he said, standing to shake my hand with the same firm grip as yesterday, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." His office felt like a library. Walls lined with legal volumes, an antique desk that probably cost more than my car, and the faint smell of leather and old books. But unlike yesterday's sterile conference room, this space felt warm, lived in. "Before we begin," he said, settling into his chair and opening a thick file with my name on it, "I want you to know that everything we discussed today is confidential. Your grandmother was very specific about that." I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. "Rose Caldwell first came to me 3 years ago," he continued, and I felt my eyebrows rise. 3 years? Not 2 like the receptionist had said. "She was concerned about her family dynamics and wanted to ensure her true wishes were honored after her death." True wishes. The phrase settled in my stomach like a stone.
She told me about your relationship with her, the weekly visits, the care you provided, the way you were treated by other family members. His voice was matter of fact, but his eyes held warmth. She was very clear about wanting to protect what she called her real granddaughter. The tears I'd been holding back since yesterday finally spilled over. I fumbled for tissues from the box he pushed across his desk, embarrassed by my emotional response, but unable to stop it. She knew, I whispered. She knew everything, Anna. She saw how they excluded you from family events, how they treated your caregiving as an obligation rather than love, how they dismissed your opinions and made you feel invisible. He opened the file and pulled out several documents. She was furious about it. The image of my gentle grandmother being furious about anything seemed almost impossible. She'd always been so composed, so diplomatic when family tensions arose at holidays or gatherings. 3 years ago, she began what she called documentation. Every time she witnessed or experienced something that demonstrated the family's treatment of you, she wrote it down. Dates, times, exact conversations. She was building a case. A case for what? For why her true will should supersede the document your family read yesterday. The words hit me like lightning. What do you mean, her true will? Mr. Morrison's smile was subtle but unmistakable. The will they read yesterday was legitimate but incomplete. Your grandmother created what's called a supplementary testamentary document that specifically addresses irregularities in how her estate was being discussed and planned.
He pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and notarizations that made it look important in ways I didn't fully understand. 6 months ago, your grandmother discovered that Patricia had been pressuring her to change her will. Phone calls, visits, subtle manipulations designed to ensure you received nothing significant. His voice hardened slightly. Patricia even suggested that Rose's attachment to you was unhealthy, and that leaving you substantial assets would only enable your dependence. My hands clenched into fists. The casual cruelty of it, turning Grandma Rose's love for me into something pathological, something that needed to be corrected. Your grandmother began recording their conversations. He pulled out a small digital recorder, no bigger than a smartphone, and placed it on the desk between us. My heart stopped. With her permission, I'm going to play you some excerpts. I want you to understand what she was dealing with and why she took the actions she did. He pressed play, and Patricia's voice filled the room, clear as if she were sitting right beside us. Rose, I know you think you're being kind to Anna, but you're really doing her a disservice. She needs to learn to stand on her own 2 feet instead of relying on your generosity. Grandma Rose's voice came next, frailer than I remembered, but still carrying that quiet strength I had always admired. Anna takes care of me, Patricia. She doesn't rely on my generosity. She earns it. But the will you've shown me leaves her the same as Marcus and Jessica. That's not fair to them, Rose. They have families to provide for, real responsibilities. Anna is single, she has a job, she doesn't need what? Love? Security? The knowledge that her sacrifices were appreciated? The recording crackled slightly, and I heard Patricia's frustrated sigh. I'm just saying maybe a small token would be more appropriate, something sentimental. The house and the investments should go to your blood family who can actually use them. Blood family? As if I weren't Grandma Rose's son's daughter. As if 8 years of weekly visits and midnight emergency calls counted for nothing because I didn't share Patricia's last name. Mr. Morrison stopped the recording. There are hours more, Anna. Months of Patricia calling your grandmother, sometimes daily, pushing this narrative that you were taking advantage of her kindness. I felt sick, not just hurt, but physically nauseated by the calculated nature of it. Patricia hadn't just been cold to me, she had been actively working to ensure I got nothing. What did Grandma Rose do? She came to me with these recordings and asked me to draft what she called a truth will, a document that would supersede the original if certain conditions were met.
What conditions? If you were excluded from the initial reading, if Patricia or her children attempted to sell the house immediately, if anyone suggested you weren't deserving of your inheritance. His smile grew wider. Your grandmother was remarkably thorough in predicting their behavior. I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. So, yesterday, when they excluded me from the reading, they triggered the conditions that activate the supplemental will. Every single one of them. The room seemed to spin slightly. What does the supplement say? Mr. Morrison opened another folder, this one thick with documents and photographs. The house on Elmwood Drive goes to you, along with a fund specifically established for its maintenance and upkeep. The investment portfolio, all of it, goes to you. There are also several smaller accounts they don't know about, including one your grandmother started the day you moved in with her as a child.
The numbers he showed me made no sense at first. Too many zeros. Amounts that seemed impossible for the woman who'd clipped coupons and shopped sales at the grocery store. Your grandmother was far wealthier than your family realized. She lived modestly by choice, but she'd been investing wisely for decades. The total estate value is approximately $8.2 million. $8.2 million! I repeated the number in my head, trying to make it feel real. But there's more, Anna. She also documented every instance of your care for her. Every doctor's appointment, every emergency call, every time you rearranged your life to help her. She kept receipts for groceries you bought, photos of the garden work you did, thank you notes you wrote. He pulled out a manila envelope thick with papers. She built a case that you were essentially her unpaid caregiver for 8 years. Why does that matter? Because Georgia law allows for caregiver compensation in estate settlements, based on her documentation, she calculated that your services were worth approximately $50,000 per year. With interest compounded over 8 years, he pulled out a calculator and showed me the screen. $468,000 in caregiver compensation, separate from the inheritance. The numbers were becoming surreal. I felt like I was floating outside my body, watching someone else's life unfold. When does this happen? When do they find out? That depends on you. Mr. Morrison leaned back in his chair. The supplementary will takes effect immediately, but we can choose how to notify the other parties. We could call them in for a meeting, send formal notification, or... His pause carried weight. We could let them proceed with their plans and intervene at the most appropriate moment. Something in his tone suggested he had thoughts about the timing. Your grandmother specifically requested that Patricia be allowed to show her true character before the full truth was revealed. She wanted no doubt about the motivations and the treatment you'd endured. I thought about Marcus already talking about appraising the house, Jessica's dismissive laughter, Patricia's text telling me not to get my hopes up. What does letting them proceed look like? Well, they'll likely move quickly to list the house, divide the known assets, perhaps even begin liquidating some investments. Each action they take while believing they're the sole beneficiaries becomes evidence of their true priorities. He tapped his pen against the desk. Your grandmother was very interested in seeing whether they would reach out to you at all once they had what they wanted. The cruelty of it was almost breathtaking, but so was the justice. She wanted them to have the opportunity to do the right thing, to include you, to acknowledge your sacrifices, to treat you with the respect you'd earned. If they had done that, the supplementary will would never have been activated. But they hadn't done that. They'd done exactly what Grandma Rose had predicted, exactly what she'd hoped they wouldn't do. What happened to what they received yesterday? Legally, nothing. The original will remains valid for everything not specifically addressed in the supplementary document. Marcus keeps the small savings account that was left to him, about $15,000. Jessica keeps her jewelry and personal items. But the house, the investments, the real assets? He gestured to the documents spread across his desk. Those were never actually theirs to begin with.
My phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, I glanced at it and felt my blood turn to ice. It was from Marcus, realtor coming to look at the house Friday. Need you to make sure it's clean and staged. Consider it your last contribution to your family." Mr. Morrison noticed my expression and raised an eyebrow. I showed him the text, and his smile turned sharp. "Perfect timing," he said. "Would you like to attend that real estate appointment?" Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Atlanta feel like a postcard. I stood in Grandma Rose's kitchen at 9:15, 15 minutes before the realtor was scheduled to arrive, running my fingers along the worn wooden countertops where she taught me to roll pie dough. The house felt different now that I knew it was mine, not just filled with memories, but actually, legally, mine. Mr. Morrison had spent the previous 2 days walking me through the legal mechanics of what was about to unfold. Probate procedures, estate law, the specific Georgia statutes that protected Grandma Rose's right to create supplementary testamentary documents. My head spun with phrases like holographic codicils and testamentary capacity. But the bottom line was simple. Everything they thought they owned, they didn't. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:30. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus straightening his tie, flanked by a woman in a sharp blazer holding a tablet and measuring tape. The realtor, Karen, something or other, according to the business card Marcus had left on the kitchen counter like a calling card claiming ownership. I opened the door with a smile I'd been practicing all morning. "Marcus, right on time." He looked genuinely surprised to see me there, as if he'd forgotten I still had keys to what he considered his property. "Anna, I thought you'd..." He gestured vaguely, clearly having assumed I'd make myself scarce for this appointment. "I wanted to be here for this," I said brightly, stepping aside to let them in. "You know how much this house means to me?" The realtor, Karen Hutchinson, according to her enthusiastic introduction, immediately began taking photos and measurements, chattering about great bones and period details, while Marcus followed her around like a proud new owner. I trailed behind them, watching him transform into a different person, confident, proprietary, already calculating profit margins on a house that held 43 years of someone else's life. "What are you thinking for asking price?" he asked Karen as she measured the windows in what used to be my bedroom when I lived here during high school. "Well, comparable sales in this neighborhood have been strong. I'm thinking we start at $650 and see what happens. Could go higher if we get a bidding war." $650,000. I did the math quickly. After realtor fees and taxes, Marcus and Jessica would split maybe $550,000. Meanwhile, the house's actual appraised value, according to Mr. Morrison's files, was $820,000. And that doesn't include the maintenance fund Grandma Rose had established or the investment accounts that would actually cover any property taxes or repairs for decades to come.
My phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Morrison. "Recording device active. Everything is being documented." I'd almost forgotten about the small microphone clipped inside my jacket. Mr. Morrison had insisted on recording this interaction, explaining that Marcus's behavior toward the property would be crucial evidence if Patricia's family tried to challenge the supplementary will later. "Anna, you've been quiet," Marcus said as we headed back downstairs. "Any thoughts on the staging? You know the house pretty well." The condescension in his tone was breathtaking, as if my 8 years of maintaining this house, of knowing every creaky floorboard and temperamental faucet, qualified me to be his unpaid interior decorator. "I have some thoughts," I said carefully. "Actually, Marcus, could we talk privately for a minute? Karen, would you mind taking a few more photos of the garden? Grandma Rose was so proud of her roses." Marcus looked annoyed, but nodded. Karen seemed delighted to have more time to document what she clearly saw as a solid commission. "What's up?" he asked once we were alone in the living room. I took a breath, remembering Mr. Morrison's coaching. Give him every opportunity to do the right thing. "I was wondering if you'd given any thought to including me in decisions about the house." His eyebrows shot up. "Including you? How?" "Well, I lived here for several years. I've been taking care of the maintenance, the garden, the repairs. I was thinking maybe we could discuss some kind of arrangement where I could buy out part of your share or..." Marcus's laugh cut me off. It was the same dismissive sound from the law office, but crueler in the space where Grandma Rose had loved me unconditionally. "Anna, come on. You work at a vet clinic. This house is worth more than you make in 10 years. Jessica and I have real expenses, real families to think about." Real families. As if my life were somehow less real, less deserving of consideration. "I know I can't match the full market value, but I thought maybe..." family would... Family! The word sounded bitter in his mouth. You know what Grandma Rose told me last Christmas? She was worried you were getting too dependent on her, that you needed to learn to make your own way in the world instead of relying on her generosity. The lie was so smooth, so casually delivered, that for a moment I almost believed it. But I'd been with Grandma Rose last Christmas. I'd helped her wrap the presents she'd bought for Marcus's kids she barely saw but never forgot. I'd listened to her worried that she wasn't doing enough for me, not the other way around. She said that? She did. Look, Anna, I get that this is hard, but holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. Sometimes the kindest thing is letting go. The gaslighting was masterful, reframing his desire to profit from the sale as concern for my emotional well-being, making me the problem for wanting to preserve the place where I'd been happiest. Karen's voice carried in from the garden. These rose bushes are gorgeous. The landscaping alone adds significant value. Marcus's attention snapped toward the window. Yeah, Anna's been keeping up with the yard work. Good thing since it'll help with the sale. 8 years of labor reduced to keeping up with the yard work? 8 years of love dismissed as maintenance that benefited his bottom line.
What if I don't want you to sell? I asked quietly. His expression hardened. It's not your choice, Anna. The house is mine now. Grandma Rose left it to me, and I'm going to do what's best for everyone involved. Everyone, meaning him and Jessica. I didn't qualify as part of everyone in his calculations. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Mr. Morrison. Perfect. More than enough evidence. Stand by. Karen returned from the garden, a tablet full of photos and enthusiasm. This is going to show beautifully. I think we can have it on the market by next week if you're ready to move quickly. Absolutely, Marcus said. Anna, you'll need to have your things out by Wednesday so we can stage properly. My things. The few belongings I'd left here over the years, but also the deeper assumption that I would simply comply, simply disappear to make his sale more convenient. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, I think there might be some complications with the timeline. Marcus frowned. What kind of complications? Instead of answering, I called Mr. Morrison's number. He picked up on the first ring as we'd arranged. Mr. Morrison? Yes, they're here now. Uh-huh. Yes, the realtor too. I see. Should I put you on speaker? I looked at Marcus, whose frown was deepening into something closer to alarm. My grandmother's estate attorney needs to speak with you. I thought we already handled all the estate stuff. But he nodded for me to put the call on speaker. Good morning. Mr. Morrison's voice filled the room with that same quiet authority I'd come to appreciate. Am I speaking with Marcus Caldwell? Yes, this is Marcus. I'm not sure why. Mr. Caldwell, I'm calling to inform you that there are legal issues with the property transfer you're attempting to execute. Karen looked up from her tablet, suddenly alert. Real estate agents had finally tuned radar for anything that might complicate a commission. What kind of legal issues? Marcus's voice had lost its confident edge. I represent your grandmother's estate in matters related to a supplementary testamentary document that affects the disposition of the Elmwood Drive property. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. Marcus's face had gone pale. I don't understand. We already had the will reading. The house was left to me. The document you're referencing was incomplete, Mr. Caldwell. I have in my possession a holographic codicil executed by your grandmother 6 months ago that specifically addresses the Elmwood Drive property. Karen was already packing up her equipment, recognizing the signs of a deal about to collapse. That's impossible, Marcus said, but his bluster sounded forced. Patricia would have known about any other documents. Mrs. Patricia Caldwell was not privy to all of your grandmother's legal arrangements, particularly those created in response to her attempts to influence the estate distribution. I watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, denial, and growing panic. Her attempts to influence? What are you talking about?
Mr. Caldwell, are you currently at the Elmwood Drive property with a real estate agent? Marcus's eyes darted to Karen, then to me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time that morning. Yes, but then you are in violation of the property interests established by the supplementary will. I'm going to need you to cease all sales activities immediately. This is ridiculous, Marcus snapped, but his bluster sounded forced. You can't just call up and claim there's some mystery document that overturns a legal will. I'm not claiming anything, Mr. Caldwell. I'm informing you of documented legal facts. The supplementary will has been filed with the probate court as of this morning. You should receive official notification within 48 hours. Karen had finished packing up and was edging toward the door. Mr. Caldwell, I think it's best if we postpone this listing until you resolve these legal questions. No, wait! Marcus called after her, but she was already gone, her heels clicking rapidly down the front walk.
The mahogany door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the marble hallway of Whitman and Associates law firm. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes of my family settling into leather chairs around a conference table I wasn't invited to occupy. The muffled voices carried just enough to make out my brother Marcus's laugh, that same hollow sound he'd perfected at every family gathering where I'd been the punchline.
The post was from someone called Concerned Neighbor 47. Anyone else remember how Anna Caldwell was always at Rose's house doing maintenance and caregiving while the rest of that family only showed up for holidays? Makes you wonder who really deserved to inherit what. The post had 37 replies, most of them sharing similar observations. I remember her shoveling Rose's driveway during that ice storm while the son and his wife were in Florida. Anna was the one who drove Rose to all her doctor appointments. That Patricia woman always seemed cold to me. This is destroying our family's reputation, Jessica hissed. Mom's getting phone calls at work from people asking about the recordings. People she's worked with for years think she's some kind of monster now. Maybe she should have thought about that before she tried to manipulate a dying woman, I said quietly. Jessica's composure cracked. You have no idea what you've done. Mom built her career on her reputation in this community. She volunteers at the hospital, she's on 3 charity boards, she teaches Sunday school. And now, everyone thinks she's some calculating gold digger who abused an elderly woman. The recordings speak for themselves, Jessica. The recordings are taken out of context. Mom was trying to protect Grandma Rose from making decisions that would hurt the family long term. You were getting too dependent on her generosity, and everyone could see it. The gaslighting was automatic, reflexive. Even now, with documented evidence of Patricia's manipulation tactics, Jessica was still defending the narrative that my love for Grandma Rose had been somehow unhealthy or inappropriate. Jessica, your mother spent months telling my grandmother that loving me was a mistake, that I was taking advantage of her, that I didn't deserve to be treated like real family because I wasn't her biological granddaughter. I pulled out my phone and opened the transcript app Mr. Morrison had given me access to. Would you like me to read you the exact quotes? Her face went pale beneath her expensive makeup. You're destroying everything we've built. Our standing in the community, our relationships, Your reputation was built on a lie. The lie that you were the loving family and I was the outsider who didn't belong. Now people know the truth. Thursday's revelation came from an unexpected source. The Atlanta Business Journal ran a feature on Patricia's marketing consulting firm, Caldwell Communications. The article, titled When Personal Scandals Impact Professional Reputation, detailed how several of Patricia's clients had quietly ended their contracts following what the reporter delicately termed revelations about personal conduct in family matters. The article included quotes from former clients. Patricia always presented herself as someone with strong family values, said Rebecca Harrison, whose restaurant chain had used Caldwell Communications for 3 years. But the recordings that have come to light show a very different side of her character,
We can't have our brand associated with someone who would manipulate an elderly family member. Another client, speaking anonymously, was more direct. The recordings are damning. This woman spent months psychologically manipulating a dying woman to cut her own granddaughter out of her inheritance. What does that say about her ethics in business relationships? Patricia's professional world was crumbling as quickly as her personal reputation had collapsed. Friday brought the social media explosion I'd been dreading. Someone had created a Facebook group called Justice for Rose Caldwell that had grown to over 2,000 members in 48 hours. The group was sharing excerpts from the court filings, photos from Grandma Rose's church and community involvement, and testimonials from people who'd witnessed the family dynamics over the years. The posts were devastating. I worked at Rose's doctor's office for 10 years. Anna was listed as her emergency contact and came to every appointment. Patricia only showed up twice, both times to argue about treatment costs. Margaret K. Rose used to talk about Anna constantly at our book club meetings, how proud she was, how worried she was that the family didn't appreciate her. This inheritance situation doesn't surprise me at all. Linda M. I lived next door to Rose for 15 years. Anna was there every week doing yard work, bringing groceries, just spending time. The others, maybe Christmas and Easter if Rose was lucky. David T.
But the post that went viral came from someone I didn't expect. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the geriatrician who treated Grandma Rose during her final illness. I'm normally very private about patient matters, but since this case involves public legal filings about elder abuse, I feel compelled to speak. Rose Caldwell was one of the sharpest, most mentally competent patients I ever treated. Right up until her death, she was making clear, rational decisions about her care and her affairs. The idea that she was confused or manipulated is absolutely false. If anything, she was more aware of family dynamics than most people half her age. She knew exactly what she was doing with her estate planning, and she did it for very good reasons. Dr. Hendricks' post was shared over 800 times within 6 hours. Saturday morning, I was having coffee on Grandma Rose's front porch, my front porch now, when a local news van pulled up. The reporter, a polished woman in her 30s, approached with a cameraman in tow. "Miss Caldwell, I'm Sarah Chen from Channel 11 News. We're doing a segment on elder financial abuse and family manipulation. Would you be willing to share your story?" I almost said no automatically. Media attention felt dangerous, exposing. But then I thought about Grandma Rose's careful documentation, her insistence that truth should triumph over comfort, her desire that I never let them make me feel like I didn't belong. "Let me call my attorney," I said. An hour later, Mr. Morrison arrived with his own media strategy. "We do this on our terms. No ambush questions, no editing to create false drama. This is about elder abuse and justice, not family gossip." The interview aired Sunday evening during the prime local news slot. Sarah Chen framed the story expertly. It's a case that has divided an Atlanta family and raised questions about how we protect elderly relatives from financial and emotional manipulation. But in this story, the manipulation didn't come from outside, it came from within the family itself. The segment included audio excerpts from Patricia's recorded phone calls, photos of me caring for Grandma Rose over the years, and testimonials from neighbors and community members. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah asked me directly, "What would you say to people who claim you manipulated your grandmother?" I looked directly into the camera and said, "I would say that love isn't manipulation. Taking care of someone isn't manipulation. Being there when they're scared or lonely or sick isn't manipulation. But convincing an elderly woman that the person who loves her most is actually taking advantage of her, that is manipulation. And thankfully, my grandmother was smart enough to document it." The story generated over 300 comments on the Channel 11 Facebook page within 2 hours. The overwhelming majority supported my side, sharing their own stories of family members who'd been isolated from loving relatives by manipulative family members. By Sunday night, Patricia's world had completely inverted. The woman who'd spent years controlling narratives and managing reputations was now the subject of community gossip, professional consequences, and public scrutiny.
Her attempts to paint me as the manipulator had backfired spectacularly, exposing her own tactics to a community that had watched them play out for years but never had a name for what they were witnessing. The public reckoning wasn't something I orchestrated or even wanted. It was simply what happened when the truth finally had enough evidence to defend itself against years of carefully constructed lies. And for the first time in my adult life, the community that had watched me be marginalized was finally speaking up on my behalf. Justice, it turned out, looked a lot like people who'd stayed silent for years, finally finding their voices to tell the truth they'd always known but never felt empowered to share.
Your story has become a symbol of the kind of systematic elder abuse that happens within families, the letter explained. We believe your experience could help other caregivers recognize manipulation tactics and empower them to seek legal protection for their loved ones. I stared at the invitation for a full 5 minutes, reading it 3 times before the words really sank in. They wanted me to speak in front of 500 people? Social workers, attorneys, healthcare professionals, family advocates, people whose entire careers were built around understanding the dynamics I'd lived through without even recognizing them. Dr. Sarah Martinez, my boss at the clinic, found me still holding the letter during my lunch break. "Anna, you look like you've seen a ghost." I showed her the invitation and her face lit up with something between pride and excitement. "This is incredible! You have to do it!" "I can't speak in front of 500 people," I said, panic rising in my throat. "I'm not a public speaker. I'm not an expert on elder abuse. I just lived through something." "That's exactly why you need to do it," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "Those experts can quote statistics and studies all day long, but you can put a human face on what they're fighting against. You can make people understand what it actually looks like when it happens." The panic didn't subside over the next few days. Every time I thought about standing on a stage with hundreds of eyes watching me, my chest tightened. But every time I considered declining, I thought about Grandma Rose's careful documentation, her months of planning, her absolute determination that the truth should triumph over comfort. I called Mr. Morrison for advice. His response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Anna, this is perfect timing. The probate case is sealed now. Patricia and Marcus dropped their challenge last week rather than face a public trial. But that means your story never got told in full. This conference could be the platform where people finally understand the complete scope of what your grandmother documented. What if I mess it up? What if I can't explain it properly?" "You've already explained it perfectly to reporters, to me, to everyone who's listened. You don't need to be an expert, Anna. You just need to be honest." He paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Besides, I have something that might help. Your grandmother left a sealed letter with specific instructions that it only be opened if you were ever asked to speak publicly about your experience. I think it qualifies now." My heart stopped. "She left a letter?" "She did. She seemed to anticipate that your story might eventually serve a larger purpose. Would you like me to bring it over?" An hour later, I sat in my living room holding an envelope in Grandma Rose's familiar handwriting. "For Anna when she finds her voice." Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made me cry and laugh at the same time. "My dear Anna, if you're reading this, it means you've found the courage to speak your truth to the world. I'm so proud of you, though not surprised. You've always been braver than you knew. I want you to know that everything I did, the recordings, the documentation, the legal planning, wasn't just about protecting you from them. It was about protecting the truth from being buried under their version of reality. They spent years making you feel small, making you question whether your love and care had value, making you believe you were an outsider in your own family. But love leaves evidence, sweetheart. 8 years of evidence. And now that evidence can help other people recognize when they're being told that love isn't real, that care doesn't matter, that sacrifice should be invisible. Tell them about the Tuesday evening calls when I was lonely.
Tell them about the Christmas morning when you were the only one who remembered I liked to open presents before coffee. Tell them about the day you drove 4 hours to bring me soup when I had pneumonia, and how your father didn't even know I was sick. Tell them that elder abuse doesn't always look like stealing money or physical harm. Sometimes it looks like isolating someone from the people who love them. Sometimes it looks like convincing them that their love is unhealthy, their choices are wrong, their judgments are compromised. Most importantly, tell them that fighting back isn't cruel or vindictive. Sometimes fighting back is the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the person who can't fight anymore. I love you, Anna. I always did, and I always will. Your grandmother, Rose. P.S. Wear the blue dress I bought you for your birthday. It brings out your eyes, and you'll need all the confidence you can get. I read the letter 4 times, tears streaming down my face. Even from beyond the grave, Grandma Rose was still taking care of me, still anticipating my needs, still believing I was stronger than I felt. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Mr. Morrison helped me organize the key points of my story chronologically. Dr. Martinez gave me time off to practice my presentation. I even hired a public speaking coach, a kind woman named Janet, who helped me transform my nervous energy into something that felt more like passion than panic. The blue dress still fit perfectly. The morning of the conference, I woke up at 5 a.m. with my heart racing. The Georgia World Congress Center was massive, intimidating, filled with people who dedicated their lives to understanding family dynamics and elder care. I felt like an imposter walking among experts. But then I saw the program cover, which featured a photo of Grandma Rose and me from last Christmas, both of us laughing over some silly joke while we wrapped presents. Under the photo was a quote from her final recordings, "Love leaves evidence. Make sure you document it." The keynote was scheduled for 2 p.m. I spent the morning attending other sessions, listening to social workers discuss warning signs of financial abuse, attorneys explaining legal protections, healthcare providers sharing strategies for identifying isolated elderly patients. Every presentation reinforced how right Grandma Rose had been to document everything, how rare it was for families to have the kind of evidence that made my case undeniable. I told them about the exclusion from family events, the subtle messaging that my presence was tolerated rather than valued, the way my caregiving was treated as obligation rather than choice. I explained how Grandma Rose had recognized the manipulation tactics long before I had names for them. Patricia didn't steal money from my grandmother, I said, looking directly at the section where social workers were taking notes. She did something more insidious. She tried to steal my grandmother's right to love me. She tried to convince a dying woman that the person who cared for her most was actually taking advantage of her generosity. The room was completely silent. Hundreds of people leaning forward to catch every word. My grandmother fought back by documenting everything. Every manipulative phone call, every attempt to isolate me, every effort to rewrite the history of who had actually been present during her declining health. She understood that without evidence, it would be my word against theirs, and they had more credibility, more resources, more social standing. I pulled out my phone and played a 30-second excerpt from one of Patricia's recorded calls. "Rose, I'm just concerned that Anna is getting too dependent on your generosity. It's not healthy for either of you. Maybe it's time to encourage more independence." The audience's reaction was immediate. Sharp intakes of breath, knowing nods, the recognition that they'd heard these exact tactics described in textbooks and case studies. That's what psychological manipulation sounds like. It doesn't sound evil or obvious. It sounds like concern. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like someone who cares about your well-being. But listen to what it's actually saying. That love is dependence, that care is unhealthy, that the person who shows up consistently is somehow
taking advantage of your generosity. I spent 20 minutes walking them through the documentation process, showing how Grandma Rose had systematically recorded not just conversations, but actions. Photos of me maintaining her house, receipts for groceries I'd bought, calendars marking every visit and phone call. Evidence that love had been present, consistent, and unappreciated by everyone except the person receiving it. The legal victory was important, I said as I approached my conclusion. But the real victory was that my grandmother refused to let them gaslight her into believing that my love wasn't real. She refused to accept their narrative that I was the problem instead of the solution. I paused, looking out at faces that were nodding, taking notes, some wiping away tears. If you're working with families where one caregiver seems isolated or undervalued, if you're seeing elderly clients who express confusion about whether someone really cares about them or is just being nice, if you encounter situations where loving behavior is being reframed as manipulation or dependence, pay attention, document it. Love leaves evidence, but so does the attempt to destroy it. The standing ovation started slowly, with a few people in the front row rising to their feet, then spreading like a wave through the entire auditorium. It lasted nearly 5 minutes, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like the room was full of people who truly saw me, not as the problem or the outsider or the one who didn't belong, but as someone who had survived something difficult and transformed it into something useful. During the question and answer session that followed, a social worker from Savannah asked, "What would you say to family members who still insist they were trying to protect their elderly relative from manipulation?" I thought about Jessica's confrontation in the parking lot, about Marcus's panicked voicemail, about Patricia's deleted Facebook posts. I would say that protection doesn't require isolation. Protection doesn't require convincing someone that the people who love them are actually harmful. And protection definitely doesn't require systematically excluding caregivers from family decisions while expecting them to continue providing care. I paused. If your protection looks like manipulation, you might want to examine whose interests you're really protecting. Another question came from a probate attorney. How do you recommend families document caregiving to prevent these situations? Document everything, I said immediately. Take photos, keep receipts, save thank you notes, record conversations if your state allows it. Don't assume that love is obvious to people who aren't looking for it. My grandmother's evidence file was 3 inches thick because she understood that 8 years of care could be dismissed as easily as saying she was just being manipulative. The conference ended with people approaching me throughout the afternoon, social workers wanting to know more about the documentation strategies, attorneys asking about the legal precedents, adult children sharing their own stories of being isolated from elderly parents by other family members. But the encounter that mattered most came just as I was leaving. An elderly woman in her 80s approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "I've been letting my daughter-in-law convince me that my son visits too much, that he's becoming too dependent on me. After hearing your story, I realize she's been trying to isolate us from each other. I'm going home to call him right now." As I drove away from the conference center that evening, I realized that Grandma Rose had been right about more than just the legal case. My story did serve a larger purpose. By speaking publicly about what I'd experienced, I'd helped other people recognize the tactics, identify the warning signs, and understand that fighting back wasn't cruel. It was necessary. For the first time in my life, being the target had transformed into being the voice. And that voice was stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. The consequences began trickling in within days of the conference, but they came from directions I hadn't anticipated. The first call came from Patricia's sister, my Aunt Caroline, whom I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. "Anna, I saw the video from your speech online," she said.
her voice tight with something between embarrassment and anger. "I think you need to know what this is doing to Patricia. She's had to close her business, her marriage is falling apart, she's on antidepressants now." The video had over 40,000 views on the Elder Care Alliance's YouTube channel, with comments that ranged from supportive to brutal. I'd tried not to read them, but some had been impossible to ignore. "This woman, Patricia, is a sociopath. How do you manipulate a dying grandmother? Disgusting. Hope she gets what she deserves." I didn't set out to destroy her life, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. Didn't you? You stood up in front of 500 people and painted her as some kind of monster. You played recordings of private family conversations. You made her a villain in your little victim story.
The casual cruelty of little victim story hit exactly the way Caroline had intended. Even now, even with all the evidence, they still framed my experience as performance rather than reality. Those weren't private conversations, Caroline. They were manipulation sessions designed to isolate me from my grandmother. And they weren't secret. Patricia recorded some of them herself to document Anna's concerning behavior. The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to wonder if she'd hung up. "She's family, Anna. Whatever mistakes she made, she's still family, and you've destroyed her." After Caroline hung up, I sat in my kitchen, Grandma Rose's kitchen now, trying to sort through my feelings about Patricia's suffering. Part of me felt genuinely sorry for her, but another part, the part that remembered 8 years of systematic exclusion and manipulation, felt like she was finally experiencing consequences for choices she'd made deliberately and repeatedly. The professional fallout was swift and comprehensive. Within 6 weeks of the conference, Patricia had lost her remaining clients, closed Caldwell Communications, and defaulted on the lease for her downtown office space. Marcus, who worked in commercial real estate, found his own business suffering as word spread through Atlanta's professional networks about the family scandal. "People don't trust someone who would manipulate their own family," explained Jennifer Walsh, a former colleague of Marcus's, who called to warn me about the growing backlash. If he'd lie to his dying grandmother about his sister's motivations, what would he do to a business partner? But it was Jessica who surprised me the most. 2 months after the conference, she showed up at the veterinary clinic where I worked, looking smaller and less polished than I'd ever seen her. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her designer handbag had been replaced with a worn leather purse that looked like it came from Target. "Can we talk?" she asked, hovering near the reception desk like she wasn't sure she had the right to be there. We walked to a small park across from the clinic, neither of us speaking until we found a bench under an old oak tree. Jessica sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the ground. "I lost my job," she said finally. "The nonprofit where I worked said my association with the family situation was inconsistent with their values around elder care and family advocacy." I waited for her to continue, unsure whether this was an accusation or a confession. "David asked for a divorce," she continued, referring to her husband of 8 years. "He said he couldn't be married to someone who would psychologically abuse an elderly family member." Those were his exact words. The Jennifer I remembered would have been furious at this point, lashing out at me for the consequences of her own choices. But this Jessica seemed deflated, hollowed out. "I've been in therapy," she said, still not looking at me. "Dr. Richards, she specializes in family dynamics and narcissistic behavior patterns. She's been helping me understand how Mom trained me to see you as the problem instead of seeing the actual problem." This was not the conversation I'd been expecting. "Jessica, I was 12 when Dad married Mom. 12 years old, and suddenly I had this new family where there were rules about who mattered and who didn't, where love was conditional on loyalty, and loyalty meant excluding anyone Mom decided was a threat." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. I thought I was protecting my family, but Dr. Richards helped me realize I was just protecting Mom's need to control everyone around her, including me. The silence stretched between us while I tried to process this version of Jessica, vulnerable, reflective, taking responsibility instead of deflecting it.
The recordings your lawyer played, she continued, I listened to all of them after they became public, and I could hear myself in Mom's voice. The same dismissive tone, the same casual cruelty disguised as concern. I sounded exactly like her when I talked about you. A jogger passed by, followed by a woman walking her dog. Normal life continuing around us, while we sat in the wreckage of our family's dysfunction. I don't know if you can ever forgive me, Jessica said. I don't know if you should, but I needed you to know that I see it now. How we treated you, how wrong it was, how much damage we did. And I'm sorry. It was the first genuine apology I'd ever received from any of them. What about Marcus? I asked. Jessica's expression hardened slightly. Marcus still thinks Mom was basically right and you just got lucky with a good lawyer. He's been calling it legal manipulation, like Grandma Rose somehow tricked the legal system into believing her own words. The idea of Grandma Rose manipulating anyone was so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. He's talking about writing a book, Jessica continued, about how inheritance law can be weaponized by opportunistic family members. He thinks he can rehabilitate the family reputation by telling his version of the story. A book. Marcus wanted to rewrite history in print, to create a permanent record where he was the victim and I was the villain who'd stolen his rightful inheritance through clever legal maneuvering. What about Patricia? Mom's not well. The depression hit hard after she lost her business. She keeps saying she was just trying to protect the family, that she never meant for things to get so out of control. But she won't admit that what she did was wrong, just that the consequences were unfair. Even in her lowest moment, Patricia couldn't acknowledge that manipulating a dying woman had been a choice rather than a misunderstanding.
I called Mr. Morrison immediately. This is exactly what your grandmother predicted, he said after reading the letter. She specifically mentioned in her notes that they would eventually try to pressure you into sharing the inheritance once the legal dust settled. What do I do? What do you want to do, Anna? The inheritance is legally yours. You have no obligation to negotiate with people who excluded you from the family until it became financially inconvenient. I thought about Grandma Rose's letter, about her absolute conviction that I deserved to be protected from their version of reality. I thought about Jessica's therapy sessions and Marcus's plans for a book that would paint me as the villain. I thought about Patricia's depression and the business she'd lost and the marriage that was falling apart. I want to write back, I said finally, but not through lawyers. I want to respond directly. Mr. Morrison advised against it, worried that anything I wrote could be used against me later. But I needed to speak for myself, in my own words, one final time. The letter I sent to Marcus was brief. Dear Marcus, I received your request for mediation. I want you to understand why my answer is no. For 8 years, I cared for our grandmother while you lived your life. For 8 years, I was excluded from family events, dismissed from family decisions, and treated like hired help instead of family. When Grandma Rose died, you didn't even consult me about the funeral arrangements. Now that you know she left me the inheritance I earned through years of love and care, you want to negotiate. You want family peace and mediation and compromise. But you can't mediate love retroactively. You can't negotiate your way back to a relationship you never valued in the first place. And you can't ask me to give up what Grandma Rose wanted me to have just because you're finally realizing it had value. The inheritance isn't just money and property. It's proof that my care mattered, that my presence had value, that someone saw me as worthy of love and protection. You want me to give that up for the sake of family relationships that only became important to you when they became expensive. I won't be attending any mediation. The matter is settled. Anna. I sent copies to Jessica and Patricia as well, then blocked their phone numbers and email addresses. Mr. Morrison handled any subsequent legal communications, which dwindled to nothing within a month.
The most unexpected consequence came 6 months later when Dr. Richards, Jessica's therapist, contacted me about participating in a research study on family scapegoating and elder manipulation. Apparently, my case had become a teaching example in her practice, illustrating how systematic exclusion could be weaponized to isolate loving caregivers from elderly family members. "Your grandmother's documentation is unprecedented," she told me during our phone consultation. "Most families who engage in this kind of systematic manipulation don't leave evidence trails." Her recordings and notes provide a rare window into how psychological abuse operates within families.
The study was published 8 months later in the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect, with my case featured as the primary example of what they termed inheritance manipulation through caregiver isolation. My real name wasn't used, but anyone who knew the story would recognize the details. Marcus never wrote his book. According to Jennifer Walsh, his real estate business never recovered from the reputation damage, and he eventually moved to Charlotte to start over in a market where nobody knew about the family scandal. Patricia's marriage to my father didn't survive. Dad filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, though people who knew them said he'd finally recognized the manipulation tactic she'd used on him for years. He sent me a brief email 6 months after the separation. "I'm sorry, I didn't see it sooner. Your grandmother was right about everything." Jessica continued therapy and eventually found work with a different nonprofit, one focused on family reunification services. She never contacted me again directly, but she sent a card every year on the anniversary of Grandma Rose's death. Just a simple message, thinking of you and remembering her love. The aftermath had been swift and comprehensive, touching every aspect of their lives in ways I hadn't anticipated or planned. But sitting in Grandma Rose's garden, my garden now, tending the roses she'd loved, I realized that consequences were different from revenge. Consequences were simply what happened when the truth finally had enough evidence to defend itself. And the truth, as it turned out, had been worth protecting all along. 2 years after the inheritance reading that changed everything, I woke up in Grandma Rose's bedroom, my bedroom now, to sunlight streaming through curtains I'd replaced with something brighter, more hopeful. The house felt different these days, not haunted by memories of exclusion and manipulation, but warm with the possibility of new beginnings. I'd kept most of Grandma Rose's furniture, but made changes that reflected my own life taking root here. The guest room had become my home office, where I worked on the elder care advocacy consulting business I'd started 6 months ago. The formal dining room, which had hosted exactly 3 family dinners in 8 years, was now a workspace where I prepared presentations for conferences and workshops. The kitchen was where I felt her presence most strongly. Not in a ghostly way, but in the muscle memory of rolling pie dough on the worn wooden counters, in the way the morning light still hit the breakfast nook exactly the same way it had when I was 16 and eating cereal before school. I'd installed a small breakfast bar where I could work on my laptop while coffee brewed, creating something new while honoring what had been. The business had grown from my keynote speech at the Elder Care Alliance conference. Word spread through professional networks that there was someone who could explain family manipulation tactics from the inside, someone who understood both the psychological dynamics and the legal protections available. Social workers referred clients to me, elder law attorneys brought me in to help families recognize manipulation patterns. Adult Protective Services hired me to train their staff on subtle forms of psychological abuse. It wasn't what I'd planned for my life, but it felt right in ways that surprised me. Every time I helped a family understand that love shouldn't require isolation, every time I taught someone to document care patterns before they became disputed, every time I watched recognition dawn in someone's eyes as they realized they weren't crazy, their family dynamics really were unhealthy, I felt like I was honoring Grandma Rose's legacy in the most meaningful way possible.
The financial security from the inheritance meant I could choose clients based on need rather than ability to pay. I worked with families who couldn't afford traditional therapy, with elderly people whose children were pressuring them to change estate plans, with caregivers who were being gaslit into believing their sacrifices didn't matter. Last month, I'd helped a woman named Margaret, whose daughter-in-law was using remarkably similar tactics to what Patricia had employed, convincing Margaret that her son's weekly visits were unhealthy dependency and that leaving him a significant inheritance would enable his lack of ambition. Margaret had started recording conversations before the situation escalated, creating the kind of evidence trail that Grandma Rose would have admired. The most rewarding case had been the Thompson family, where 3 siblings were manipulating their father into believing his primary caregiver, his youngest daughter, was taking advantage of his generosity. By the time they contacted me, the father was confused and guilt-ridden, wondering if his gratitude towards Sarah was somehow misplaced. But Sarah had kept meticulous records of her caregiving, just as I'd taught in my workshops. The evidence spoke for itself, and the manipulation collapsed under the weight of documented truth. "You saved our relationship," Sarah's father had told me during our final session. I was starting to believe I was being foolish, that my appreciation for Sarah's care was somehow wrong. "But you helped me understand that love isn't manipulation, and care isn't exploitation." These victories felt different from the legal victory I'd won against my own family. They felt proactive rather than reactive, protective rather than defensive. Instead of waiting for manipulation to succeed and then fighting back, I was teaching people to recognize it early and document it thoroughly. The personal relationships in my life had shifted dramatically as well. Dating had been complicated for the first year after the inheritance case became public. Some men were intimidated by the media attention and the financial independence the inheritance had provided. Others seemed attracted to the money more than to me. But eventually, I'd met David Chen, a pediatric nurse who'd attended one of my presentations at Georgia Southern University. David understood family trauma in ways that made conversation easy. His own family had emigrated from Taiwan when he was 10 years old, and he'd watched his parents navigate cultural expectations while trying to protect their children from relatives who thought his father was too American and his mother was spoiling the children with too much freedom. He recognized manipulation tactics because he'd lived through different versions of them. The thing about toxic families is that they make you doubt your own perceptions. You end up thinking that maybe you really are too sensitive, too demanding, too ungrateful. It takes tremendous strength to trust your own experience when everyone around you is telling you it's wrong. We'd been together for 8 months now, and he was the first person I dated who understood that the inheritance wasn't just money. It was validation. Proof that someone had seen my love as valuable, my care as meaningful, my presence as worthy of protection. The relationship with my father had evolved slowly but significantly. After his divorce from Patricia was finalized, he'd begun reaching out more regularly. Not dramatically. He wasn't suddenly transformed into an emotionally available parent, but consistently. Monthly phone calls, birthday cards, invitations to have lunch when he was in Atlanta for work. He'd let her convince me that her way was the right way, he had admitted during one particularly honest conversation. She was so confident about everything, and I was tired of making decisions about family
Stuff. It was easier to let her handle it and just go along with whatever she thought was best. His passivity had enabled Patricia's manipulation, but his recognition of that fact felt like a foundation we could build on. We weren't close in the way I'd always wished we could be, but we were honest with each other now. That felt like progress. The house itself had become a symbol of something I was still learning to understand. For years, it had represented the one place where I'd felt truly loved and accepted. Now, it represented something more complex. The idea that love could be documented, protected, and defended. That care could be valued not just emotionally, but legally and financially. I'd turned Grandma Rose's sewing room into a small library focused on books about family dynamics, elder care, and estate planning. Clients often commented on the collection, saying it felt like walking into the office of someone who'd studied these issues academically, rather than someone who'd simply lived through them. But lived experience combined with formal knowledge created a perspective that purely academic experts couldn't offer. The speaking engagements had continued and expanded. I'd presented at conferences in 12 states,
always focusing on the practical aspects of documenting care and recognizing manipulation. But the most meaningful presentations were the ones I gave to support groups. Adult children struggling with difficult family dynamics, elder care workers trying to identify abuse, seniors worried about being manipulated by their own families. How do you know if you're being manipulated or if your family members are right to be concerned? Was the question I heard most often. My answer had evolved over 2 years of thinking about it. Manipulation seeks to isolate you from people who love you and increase your dependence on people who control you. Genuine concern seeks to strengthen your connections and increase your independence. If someone's help leaves you feeling more alone and less confident in your own judgment, pay attention to that feeling. The legal aftermath had finally settled completely. Marcus never challenged the inheritance after receiving my letter, though I heard through Jennifer Walsh that he still told people privately that I'd manipulated the legal system to steal what rightfully belonged to him. The cognitive dissonance required to believe that a dying woman could manipulate lawyers, judges, and probate courts, while simultaneously believing I'd manipulated her, was impressive in its scope. Patricia had moved to Florida to live with her sister Caroline, the same aunt who'd called to blame me for the family's destruction. According to Jessica's annual updates, Patricia still maintained that she'd been trying to protect Grandma Rose from my excessive neediness. Even in exile, even after losing her business and marriage, she couldn't acknowledge that convincing a grandmother her granddaughter didn't deserve love had been abusive rather than protective. Jessica had surprised me the most over the past 2 years. Her transformation seemed genuine and sustained. She'd completed a certification program in family systems therapy and was working with a nonprofit that helped families navigate elder care decisions without falling into manipulation patterns. She'd sent me a copy of her certification along with a note that said simply, "Learning to recognize what we did wrong so I can help other families avoid it."
We weren't close. Too much damage had been done for that, but we were civil. She'd requested permission to use our family's story anonymized in her work with other families, and I'd agreed. If our dysfunction could prevent someone else from experiencing the same isolation and manipulation, then perhaps some good could come from all the pain. The most unexpected development had been the relationship with my father's extended family. Cousins who'd been peripheral figures in my childhood began reaching out after the story became public. They shared their own memories of Patricia's controlling behavior at family gatherings, their discomfort with how I'd been treated, their regret at not speaking up when they'd noticed the exclusion. We all saw it. My cousin Michael had told me at a family reunion I'd actually been invited to for the first time in years. The way she'd arrange seating so you were always separate, the way she'd start conversations when you left the room, the way she'd dismiss anything you said as Anna being dramatic. But nobody wanted to cause family drama by calling it out. The irony was bitter. They'd allowed the actual drama to continue unchecked because they'd wanted to avoid the appearance of drama. But their belated acknowledgement felt important anyway. It confirmed that my perceptions had been accurate, that the exclusion had been real and visible to others. Last week, I'd received an email that brought the story full circle in a way I hadn't expected. A woman named Rebecca Williams had written to tell me that she'd used my case as inspiration to document her own elderly mother's manipulation by Rebecca's brother and sister-in-law. Like Grandma Rose, Rebecca's mother had begun recording conversations when she realized her son's wife was trying to convince her that Rebecca was taking advantage of her generosity. "Your grandmother's story gave my mother the courage to protect our relationship," Rebecca had written. She passed away last month, but not before ensuring that the person who actually cared for her would be protected from the people who only appeared when they wanted something. Thank you for showing us that love is worth fighting for.
The email made me cry, but they were good tears. Tears of gratitude that Grandma Rose's careful documentation had created a template other families could follow, that her refusal to let love be redefined as manipulation was still protecting relationships beyond our own. As I write this, sitting at the kitchen table where Grandma Rose and I shared thousands of meals and conversations, I'm filled with a peace I never expected to find. Not the peace of perfect family relationships, those were never really possible with people who required my diminishment for their comfort, but the peace of being seen, valued, and protected by someone who understood that love doesn't require justification or explanation. The inheritance battle taught me that some fights are worth having, not for revenge or vindication, but for the simple right to exist as yourself in the world. Sometimes standing up to toxic family members isn't about changing them, it's about refusing to let them change you. Grandma Rose gave me more than money or property. She gave me proof that I was worthy of love, that my care had value, that my presence in the world mattered enough to document and defend. In the end, that was the greatest inheritance of all, the unshakable knowledge that I deserved to be loved exactly as I was, not as someone else needed me to be. The family that excluded me from the inheritance reading thought they were writing the final chapter of our story, but Grandma Rose had already written the real ending. Love wins, truth prevails, and sometimes the best revenge is simply living fully while refusing to let anyone convince you that you don't deserve to.